Hey everyone, how are you? Good, that's great. So I'm really glad they let me out of middle school to be here with all of you because I think we have like a fun session set up. So what we're going to be talking about is creativity, more specifically timing. Because I think as marketers, a big part of our job is how do we create that right idea, that right campaign, that right message at the right time. And so I'm going to provide sort of 3 different views at this question on how you can do this as a marketer. I'm going to bring in some insights from my experience running a data company. I'm going to bring in some insights from the research I did for my book, The Creative Curve, where I interviewed 25 living creative greats. This is everyone from Michelin star chefs to billionaires and Oscar winners. Then I'm also going to bring in a story about a brand you've heard of, Ben & Jerry's. So I spent a day with the flavor team at Ben & Jerry's, and I want to tell you a little bit about what ice cream has to do with marketing and what lessons we all can learn from how they create flavors at Ben & Jerry's. So creativity is kind of like a big word, right? You'll hear it a lot at this conference. There's like lots of articles about it. There's like articles I've seen like the 10 most creative foods you can eat. But what's weird is that creativity is actually kind of hard to define, right? Like how come when I throw paint on a canvas, it's not creative, but when Jackson Pollock does, it's worth millions and millions of dollars, right? Like there's something more to creativity than just productivity. And there's some people in our culture who are very good at this, right? Those creative geniuses who hit after hit, product after product, campaign after campaign, seem to have this amazing ability to create perfect ideas. And I want us all to name some of them. Just shout it out. When you think of creative genius, who do you think of? Steve Jobs? Over here? Elon Musk? Walt Disney? Well, these are the most common answers we get. No one ever mentioned Queen Bey, which is problematic. We have Oprah. We have Beethoven. Oh, this is Mozart, popped out of the womb playing the piano. We have Beethoven looking super creepy. No one ever mentions my personal favorite, which is Taylor Swift. That's okay. You have flaws. She doesn't. Lover is such a good album. But what I think is so interesting is that in our culture, this idea of creativity is very intertwined with that of the creative genius, right? We don't talk about creativity as just some action done by a team, but we talk about and ascribe it to individuals. And so I think there's a lot to learn in looking at that. But when I said creativity is kind of hard to define, well, I think we still actually have to define it, though, even if it's difficult. And there's a definition from sociology that I think is really cool. Creativity is the ability to create things that are both novel and valuable. And the and is really important. Novel and valuable. And the reason why the and is important, well, okay, let me show you an example of something novel. I went to Microsoft Paint, and I created this. It's certainly novel. It's definitely not valuable, and it's not creative to anyone other than my mother. Now, on the other hand, I recently learned, and this is true, this is kind of a joke, but I recently learned how to do conditional color formatting in Excel. You look so smart, it's so easy, right? And this is certainly valuable, but it's definitely not creative. So what creativity is this intersection where something is both new and valuable at the same time. And we have another term for these things. We call things that are both new and valuable hits. This doesn't just mean hits in the sort of Taylor Swift sense, right? But when there's a hit paper at an academic conference, when there's maybe a hit session at a marketing conference, but when a group of people, big or small, say that something is both novel and valuable, we call it a hit. So what's really cool is that when you look at a lot of the research around trends and consumer preferences, a lot of it has to do with understanding why groups of people say certain things are in versus certain things are out. And so that's what we're going to dive into a little bit. So I want to start with a little experiment. Is anyone here named Lisa? Okay, that doesn't count, but that's close. No Lisas. Good, so there'll be no cheating. So here's the experiment. I want you all to name some famous Lisas. I want you just to shout it out. Kudrow Bonet, Mona Lisa, Lisa Simpson, not a okay, who else? Okay, that's good. Oh, wow. Okay, this is good. You are a good Lisa group. So these are the 4 most common answers. Lisa Marie Presley, Lisa Kudrow, Lisa Lampanelli, Lisa Bonet. You guys got 3 out of the 4. Now here's the harder part of the question. What do all of these women have in common? And don't be that guy who says they're women or they're famous, and it's always a guy. They were all born in the 1960s. Lisa was the #1 name. It was the hit name of the entire decade. Every year but 2 years of the 1960s, it was the #1 name in the entire country. Interesting. But here's where it got kind of sad. By 2016, Lisa had fallen to the 833rd most popular name, and there were only 342 baby girls in the entire country named Lisa. The New York Times literally published an article titled, "Where Have All the Lisas Gone?" We have how do you spell it? Lisa. Very different. And this is a chart, by the way, from the Social Security Administration of Lisas per 100,000 babies. It's not good. So what's interesting to us when we want to understand trends and we want to understand consumer preferences is why do ideas fall in favor and out of favor, right? There's a rise and a fall. The things we love, the things we adore, right? Eventually we get bored of them. So why? So we're first going to talk about the rise, and then we're going to talk about the fall. So the rise. So we're going to go on a trip. We're going to go to China. Get your air miles ready. And we're going to take part in a famous study from a famous psychologist. And I want you all to look at this Chinese character. If any of you speak or read Mandarin, please do not help your neighbors. So look at this famous character. And I want you to decide whether or not you think it has a positive meaning or a negative meaning. So positive meaning or a negative meaning. And now raise your hands if you think it's positive. It's like 70% of you, okay. Negative? It's like 25% of you. That math doesn't work. Okay, this is a pretty optimistic crowd. Well, here's the thing. What it means is nothing. I tricked you. It's a made-up Chinese character. And this is from a very famous psychology study by a guy named Robert Zionk, who had this theory in the 60s that maybe how often we had seen something affects whether or not we like or dislike it. So what he did in this study is he took a bunch of made-up Chinese characters, shapes, objects, all these different things, and he showed them to different groups of people different amounts of time. Right? So he showed it to this group 5 times, this group 10 times, this group 15 times. And then he asked, A, do you like or dislike it? And B, how positive do you think it is? And here's where it got kind of crazy. What he found was that merely the more exposed people were to something, even something made up, the more positive they thought it was, and the more they said they liked it. He wasn't a marketer, so he named this the mere exposure effect. And it's the idea that the more you see something, the more you like it. The more familiar you are, the more positive you feel towards it. And this has big implications for us as marketers, right? This is why we have logos and brand colors, and we try and repeat messages. This is a huge thing for marketers. But why is this so, right? Why would we crave things that are familiar? Well, it goes back to evolutionary biology. So think about it like this. One of the things your brain evolved to do was to keep you safe. And your brain has kind of realized that things that are unknown represent potential risks to that safety. So like, for example, let's say you broke into your neighbor's house. I don't know why. And you went into the basement. And there was like this weird, creepy door, right? You'd be like, I'm not going in that door. That door's terrifying. I don't want to die. Now, imagine that same door was in your grandmother's house. And it's where she stored the wine. You'd be like, I love that door. Let's go. Like, I want the Pinot. And so what you find is that things, even though they are physically exactly the same, still the same creepy door, we can have radically different feelings about it because we've been exposed to and we know it's not a threat. So the result is the more we see something, the more we report liking it. Okay, that makes sense. But if that were true, why isn't everyone in this room named Lisa, right? Why wouldn't, as there's more Lisas, all of us would want to be Lisas, right? Why is she the only quasi-Lisa? Everyone here should be Lisa. We should be in Lisa land. By the way, this is the stock photo, at least it was when I made this. When you Google image search Lisa land, which is like, there's something weird going on. Anyway, So why are we not living in Lisa land, right? Why do things fall out of favor, right? Why do they fall out of favor? So to answer this, we're going to go to another study from our friendly trickster, Robert Zionk. And this time, he's not going to trick us. So he had put out this study. He got a lot of fame and notoriety. If you've ever taken a Psych 101 course, you've read a lot of his work. But he had this feeling. He was like, okay, like, I get that, the mere exposure effect. But that doesn't really make sense because in real life, we're not flashing things at people all the time, right? That's not how real life works. We like read a book or we watch a movie. So what would happen if rather than flashing something at someone, we took something more complex, like a piece of abstract art, and we told them to study it? But we told them to study it different amounts of time. So some people we said study it once, some people 3 times, 6 times, 25 times. And what he found was really interesting. It was different. What he found was that at first, the more they saw it, the more they liked it. But then at a certain point, they started to get bored. They were like, I don't want to see this again. Like, let's see another piece of art. What he found is this U-shaped relationship, where when you map exposure to preference, at first, people like it more and more, but then another instinct kicks in. At a certain point, it turns out as humans, we also seek novelty. We also want things that are new, right? This is why sometimes we want new restaurants, new vacations, maybe even new friends. But why? So this goes back again to evolutionary biology where, think about if you were like a prehistoric cave dweller. You were probably a very elegant cave dweller. And you were walking in a field and you saw this like weird little mini strawberry. Well, your brain is saying, oh, this is new, but it represents potential reward. This could be calories, this could be breakfast, this might taste delicious. I should try it. So our brain is wired for potential reward. So we seek out the things that are novel. But this is a contradiction, right? Because literally what I just told you is that on one side, we seek out the familiar for safety. On the other side, we seek out novelty for potential reward. Those are opposites, right? That doesn't make any sense. Well, it turns out that this contradiction is actually our brain's really elegant way of balancing risk and reward. We like things that are familiar enough to be safe, but yet novel enough to be interesting and new. So like, for example, if you were in that same field again, elegant cave dweller, and you saw this, you'd be like, that's too weird. That's too new. It's like a weird red pitted olive, which is good because that's a U seed. It will kill you. So the result of these contradictory instincts, this pursuit of the novel and the pursuit of the familiar, is this finding that academics call, I'm not going to say this again because it's so terrible, ready? The inverted U-shaped relationship between familiarity and preference, which I rebranded the creative curve because it's a better book title. And so basically, it's this finding that when you map familiarity against how much people like something, you find this U-shaped relationship over and over and over again, whether it's music or movies or art or fashion or anything. What you find is that at first, things are too new and they're scary, and then as people are more exposed to it, they like it more and more before they start liking it less and less. Think about that first time you heard that new Drake song, right? You're like, oh, this is kind of weird. Oh, this is pretty good. Nice for what? And then you like it less and less with each additional listen. And I break this into 5 stages that I think are really useful for marketers. And then we're going to talk about how to triangulate on this curve. So the first stage of this curve is what I call fringe interest. This is when an idea is only safe for those like super hip people, right? Like the people who are like really into it, the early adopters. So if you watched Men's Fashion Week last year, for example, I don't know what happened. If you watched Men's Fashion Week last year, you'd see that this was the big trend in winter coats, these like big flowy coats. I don't see any of you wearing that, right? But in a few years, you will, because that's how trends work. But right now, this is just acceptable to early adopters. Now, the next stage is actually the most important stage of the entire thing. The next stage is where ideas are in that sweet spot of familiarity and novelty, where with a little bit additional exposure, they'll go from low interest to high interest very, very quickly. This is where, when we talk about creative geniuses, whether they be marketers or product leaders or anything, when we talk about creative geniuses creating great ideas, what we're really saying is they have this ability to create ideas in this sweet spot of the creative curve over and over again. And so like one of my favorite examples of this is, you've probably seen on Facebook that viral video of, it's in Lower Manhattan, and there's all these people lined up in front of an ice cream shop, but it's not actually an ice cream shop. It's actually a cookie dough scoop shop. And this is a great example of something. It's become a big trend. There's now a bunch of them in New York. There's a whole bunch of competitors coming all over the country. Whole Foods now carries brands of edible cookie dough. But this is an example of a trend which is both familiar and novel. It's cookie dough, but it's ice cream. It's ice cream, but it's cookie dough. And eventually, like all consumer trends, this will become passé, right? Do you remember, what is it, Pinkberry? No, you don't. So eventually ideas reach a point where our novelty seeking kicks in and we start wanting things that are new. And I call this the point of cliche. And I'm going to give you an example of something reaching this that I think is like the best example of this. It involves a mid-2000s reality TV show reference. Are some of you going to help me? Okay, reality TV show watchers. His name was John. Her name's Kate. They had 8 children. John and Kate plus 8. Yeah, remember that? Well, John Gosling is also the man responsible for killing off the clothing brand Ed Hardy. John Gosling started wearing Ed Hardy in January 2009, at which point marked the ascent, or the peak, of Ed Hardy, and it went from $900 million a year in sales to today it only does $27 million. Don Ed Hardy, the original designer, blames this guy for that. Ed Hardy used to be cool. Like, there were literally, like, there's pictures of Beyonce and Jay-Z wearing Ed Hardy, I swear. But it became overexposed. It became overly familiar, right? It was licensed on all these lighters and car decals and all this stuff, where it just became too familiar, and our novelty-seeking won out. Now, the next stage is actually the stage where, if you're part of a big organization, I think is probably the most risky. And this is the stage that I call follow-on failure. And this is the stage where usually what happens is big companies see ideas in the sweet spot. They're like, oh, that's pretty cool. And then they start working on something, and then they release it, and it's still sort of popular, right? It's at the peak. But then 3 months later, everyone's like, oh, that's old news, and you get fired from your job, right? So at big companies, this is a big problem. And a great example of this is if you work in alcohol or beverages, like you've probably noticed for the last few years, there has been like every possible iteration of a certain drink called rosé, right? There's rosé in a can. There's rosé popsicles. There's rosé seltzer. There's rosé juice. I don't even know what that is. There's all different types of rosé. And so you might go and say, oh, well, it's popular. We should create something too. But that's the wrong answer. What you really want to be doing is creating like Aperol Spritz in a can, right? You want to be a little bit ahead of the curve. You don't want to be doing what's popular now. This is one of the biggest mistakes that marketers make. We look at best practices, and we forget that they're best practices for now, but by the time we do them, it's no longer going to be there. The final stage, I think, is the easiest one to avoid, right? This is good if you want to take a picture, is when things are out of date. Right? This is when ideas are clearly out of date. They're clearly past their prime, right? You don't want to start collecting records or open a disco store or be that like weird person who's really into Beanie Babies. Like, that's not what you want to be doing right now. So the question then for marketers, and the question for anyone whose job it is to create, whether you're a writer or a designer, is how do we create things in that sweet spot? How do we create things in that sweet spot of the creative curve? And this is where I want to bring up a certain ice cream brand, Ben & Jerry's, and I want to talk about how the Ben & Jerry's team can teach us a little bit about creating that right tension of familiarity and novelty. So I went and spent a day with the flavor team at Ben & Jerry's, which is like the best job in America. They literally spend all day coming up with new flavors. Weirdly enough, they're all in Burlington, Vermont. They're all kind of skinny, which I think is like suspicious, right? They're like, we like to bike. I'm like, okay. But anyway, their office is like crazy, right? So their office is, this is designed in the 90s, right? But it looks kind of like a startup, right? There's like literally a slide. There was one thing that I thought was kind of odd. They had a nursing room, which they called the Milky Way, which I thought was like vaguely inappropriate. But it's like a cool office, right? And what I thought was so interesting is that their job every year is to come up with 12 new flavors that are sort of pun intended in that sweet spot of the creative curve. That's their job. But what's so interesting is what I found is they used a process to do this that I found over and over again in lots of different types of creative fields, whether that be movies or art or marketing. And it's a 4-step process that I think is pretty repeatable. So I want to break you down how they actually come up with new flavors. So every year they have to create 12 new flavors of ice cream. And Ben & Jerry's has kept growing and growing and growing. Now does $1 billion a year in revenue. But the thing that they've done is they've kept their brand intact, right? There's still the sort of zany, weird social justice company that makes like really decadent ice cream that makes you just feel better, right? And how they've done that is by starting in these 4 steps. So the first step is conceptualization. And this is the step where they say, okay, we need to come up with a list of ideas. And this is a very human step. What they do is they literally go on these things called trend treks. Say that 10 times fast. They go on trend treks where they go to different cities and they literally consume as much as they can. They go to different bars, restaurants, farmers markets. They want to see what are the new cocktail flavors that people are doing. What are the new ingredients that are coming up? What are the things that are out there? And then they also consume trends from things like Instagram, food magazines. There's websites where you can see menus of new restaurants all across the country. And the flavor team is constantly going through and consuming all this information. And the result of this is that they have a really good understanding of where are nascent ideas on that curve, right? Because they have such wide tentacles. So what they do is every year, they take this knowledge and they come up with, and it's a pretty manual task, they come up with a list of 200 what they call flavor profiles. Flavor profiles. And those are literally written out sentences, like there's no ice cream being made, written out sentences describing a flavor. So like, for example, vanilla ice cream with cherries and fudge flakes. And they make a list of 200 ideas that they think people would want and are kind of edgy. But here's where it gets cool. So you might think, okay, these people, they're literally titled, there's flavor guru, like they're probably pretty self-confident. But their next step is actually to use data, to step back and use data. So the next step is what I call reduction. And what they do is they take their list of 200 manually curated ideas, and they reduce it to a much smaller list using data. And how they do this is surprisingly low tech. So they have a newsletter, an email newsletter, like probably many of you. It's called Chunk Mail, also vaguely inappropriate. I don't know why. And they have about 750,000 subscribers. And they take the list of 200 ideas, they chop it up into much smaller lists, and they send it out as surveys to all their subscribers. And then they ask for each flavor 2 questions. 1, how likely are you to buy this flavor? And 2, how unique is it? How likely are you to buy and how unique is it? Which is basically another way of asking, how familiar is it and how novel is it? And this is really important because you might think, if you're thinking about consumer insights, well, we should just ask them how likely they are to buy. But the problem is that if you did that, the entire brand would become brownie, cookie, caramel crunch. It would just be shelves and shelves of chocolate and cookie flavors and all this stuff, right? And they would, over time, lose that notion of a creative brand. But now if you just focused on what was novel, what was unique, you'd run into other problems. So like, I was in their lab, and one of the flavor gurus got this big look on their face, and she was like, I have an idea. And I was like, this seems problematic. And she goes, do you want to try dill pickle sorbet? And I was like, no. And she thought I was kidding. And she went to the freezer and took out this big thing of dill pickle sorbet, which they had made as like an internal gag. And dill pickle sorbet is like shockingly delicious. Like really, 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 really good. But what they were saying was that even though it's good, it's too unique, right? It kind of freaks people out. And so what they found out, though, was that if they tweaked the description of it from dill pickle sorbet to kombucha sorbet, people loved it. And even though it's the same product, the same flavor profile, that vinegary ice cream, people want things that are familiar, right? So it's not just about quality, but it's also about, are your customers ready for it? So you can't get things that are too novel. You have to balance out that familiarity and novelty. Familiar enough to be safe, novel enough to be interesting. So then is the third step. The third step is they did this survey, and they reduced their list of 200 ideas to about 20. And now their task is they have to go from 20 to 12. And this involves, again, a lot of human intervention. So in step 2, they use data. In step 3, they go back to the humans. And they do this in 2 steps. The first one is they look at their constraints. Like, what are the things that we have to abide by? And does that chop off any ideas? Like, for example, they're owned by Unilever. And Unilever has a rule that all products must have under 350 calories per serving, under 25 grams of sugar. So they're at 340 and 24. But like, they have to abide within that construct. Second is, what can they actually manufacture, right? What can they make a profit on? And third, like, what else do we have on the shelves, right? They're aware that they can't have 8 new lavender flavors, right? You have to be aware of what else is out there. And then they actually start making the ice cream, finally, right? And they actually create samples, and they send them out to their ice cream shops, and they ask for feedback from the franchise owners. What did people like? What did they not like? But what's interesting here is how late in the process that comes, right? Up until this point, the entire process was humans and data, right? There was no ice cream being made up until right now. That is when they actually, again, bring in that qualitative feedback. Okay, so now they have 12 flavors that they're going to go to market with. They release them. They send them to the stores. People bring them home. The fourth and final stage of the process is feedback. Once you've actually put something to market, you have to listen. And I'll explain more of why listening is so important in a second. But how they listen, I think, is really cool, because it's a combination of sort of lo-fi and hi-fi, right? They do hi-fi things like they're looking at social media listening and monitoring services. You know, if they release a new flavor and also there's a bunch of tweets about how disgusting it is, they'll pull the flavor, right, and then try and figure out why. But the other thing I think is really cool is that Ben & Jerry's, you know, they have this beautiful headquarters in Vermont with the weird lactation room, and they have in a corner a group of 5 people at desks who are actually the Ben & Jerry's call center. They actually have their call center co-located with them, because what they realize is that one of the most immediate ways they get feedback is through that telephone number on the back of the carton. And so I'll give you a story as an example. They came out with a flavor about 10 years ago called popcorn M&Ms, which, like, if you've ever been in the movies, is delicious. Like, conceptually, you sort of get it. And they tried this flavor. They did all the tests. It aced all of them. They created some samples. People, like, loved this flavor. And then they released it. And they started getting all these calls. Oh, this is terrible. The popcorn's soggy. Well, what happens is it turns out that when you put something in ice cream, and it's on a truck, and then it's in a refrigerator at a store, and then it goes to someone's home, over those many weeks, moisture seeps into anything you put into the ice cream. So they did 2 things. 1, they pulled the flavor, but 2, they learned from this. And what they realized was that, if we want to get something soft, let's put something hard in the ice cream. So for example, when you have Ben & Jerry's and you have those soft cookie bits, in the labs, because like there was a big tray of them, I was like, they're super hard. Because they realized that they can actually use that to their advantage. That feedback, that learning, that loss actually becomes a very important part of the process. So even though I'd like to think of the process as a funnel, where you go from a lot of potential ideas to a small number of ideas, you really also have to think about it looping back, right? You have to constantly be taking that feedback and using it to iterate on what you're doing. Okay. So, you know, when we talk about this, I think the thing that's really important, that kind of the point, if I was to bring it all home, is that our jobs as creators, as marketers, is not to go off in a castle and be brilliant by ourselves. That sounds great, but it's not our jobs, right? Our job is to listen to our audience And this does not have to be fancy, right? You don't have to have a big consumer insights team. This could literally be Google Forms and Google Surveys. This could be bringing some people together at your annual conference. But if marketing is all about creating ideas that are in that sweet spot, right, that tension point of familiarity and novelty, you have to get that feedback. You have to have your audience as part of the process. You have to just do it. So we have 5 minutes for questions. But before we go into that, I want to end with a question for all of you. One of the things I've noticed when talking to marketers, and you talk about creativity and trends, is there's a lot of negative self-talk, right? We say a lot of times like, oh, I'm not that creative, or I'm not that brilliant, or I need my agency to help come up with new ideas. But I think when you actually look at the systems, the process, the research around trends and creativity and timing, what you find over and over again is it says that actually this stuff is learnable, right? This is a framework. It's a skill, it's a craft, but something you can learn. And so my question to all of you is, are you your own worst enemy when it comes to creating great ideas at the right time, right? And how can we stop that negative self-talk? And how can we do it ourselves? Thank you so much. So we have time for a couple questions over here. So I think the key thing when you're doing research and consumption and you want to understand consumers is to get to primary sources. So that's why I really like the idea of how they look at menus, right? Because literally, like, what are restaurants putting on their menu that's new, right? And so how do you find those primary sources? I think a lot of times when we're doing research and preparation, we look at other people's abstraction of those primary sources, and we look at their conclusions. But our brain is actually really good at putting things together. And so I think the key is to feed it with as much primary sources as you can. So if you're in B2B manufacturing, right, you should be reading trade journals and looking at what is the new machines that are coming out. But look at those primary sources. Great question. Thanks. Also, one other thing is that if you're into this kind of stuff, I have a newsletter, allen.xyz, where I put out about once a week, I put out a peer-reviewed creativity article. And I deduce it into some simple findings. And then on Sundays, I send out a bunch of silly stuff. And the book is on Amazon, and also they have a few left at the, whatever you call it, the bookstore. Other questions? No, it's a great question. So what you find is that different cultures are at different rates. And so like, for example, Ben & Jerry's has 2 factories. They have one in the United States that serves the entire world in terms of ideation, and they have one in Japan. Because Japan has this culture, if you've ever been, where they very quickly go through consumer trends. So like, for example, if you've ever been in Japan, they have like 25 different flavors of Kit Kats, and they're constantly coming out with new flavors. Because their culture is all about rapidly trying new things. There's a lot of advertising, there's a lot of stuff. So it depends a lot on the rate of consumption of your consumers. So this is why, for example, what is a meme on Twitter, what is a trend on Twitter, is very different than what is a trend in filmmaking, right? Because with Twitter, you're constantly consuming. And so memes come into style and out of style. With movie making, it takes much longer because people just consume less movies. And this is one of the problems that big brands have when they're trying to do social media, is that social media is a day-to-day, hour-by-hour sort of battle. And they think about it in a lot of the same ways they think about television advertising, these other things where, oh, well, like Wendy's was really snarky, let's become like Wendy's. And now it's like, how many brands can we have that are snarky on Twitter, right? Yeah, great question. So 2 thoughts. One is that the curve that we talk about is actually, like, if we were to be talking for 5 hours, is a repeating curve. So as ideas fall out of favor, eventually they become new enough again to sort of be interesting and exciting and pick up. So nostalgia is a really interesting way if you want to mine for new ideas. Like, You see this a lot, like 5 years ago, there started being this trend in music where a lot of rappers were going back and taking samples from the 60s and 70s and 80s and using that in their beats, right? Because it's a really cool way to bring in novelty. The other thing which is interesting about the curve is that you can flatten it. So again, the curve, how fast you go through is based on the rate of consumption. So one thing that a lot of brands do, if they want to be luxury, for example, is reduce exposure, less stores, increase price, right? Less consumption. And so as a result, some of these luxury brands have much, much longer lifespans as things that are in style because there's less exposure to them. But even them eventually start falling out of style. Like you look at Louis Vuitton, there was 5 years where it was sort of the bag, but now there's a lot of other bags. And so it's not that they're failing, but it's no longer the sort of peak of consumer preference. Good question. Hi, Michaela. I've never been asked that before. I don't have a super informed answer on that. I would theorize that I think parody is an interesting way to bring novelty to a familiar concept, right? So that's probably why it's pretty like fun to make fun of things and like use parody. I don't know if it's indicative of sort of late stage of a trend. I would guess so, but I don't have. I'm not going to lie and tell you I know the answer.
If you don't sell something as exciting as ice cream, like I'm in financial services, do you think this kind of thing applies, or there's
100%. Yeah, I mean, in financial services, you're seeing this right now with all the new fintechs coming in and how they're messaging and how they're branding, and the whole idea of taking a familiar concept like wealth management, right, but doing it through robo-advisors, right? And so the idea is that they're not saying this is something wholly new. A lot of times with innovation, what they say is, oh, this is a reformatting of an old concept. Right? So I think for a lot of times, if you're an established player, your job is how do we do that internally rather than get disrupted by outside forces. Right? How can we do that ourselves? And you're seeing this now with a lot of the big financial services firms are like buying up robo-advisors and fintech companies, but they're not doing new functions. They're just doing it in a new way. Cool. Thank you guys so much.